So how are we doing, guys? How have you been holding up for a couple of weeks here? Like I said, I was trying to say anyway. I'm sorry I had to cancel my previous lab there. Just had some family emergency that I had to take care of. Nothing too tragic or anything, but just had it required immediate attention on the morning of the lab. So thanks for hanging in there with me. But everybody doing okay?
Hanging.
Nice. Lots of thumbs up. Love to see that. So you're all interested in sidechain. Is that what I'm gathering from this turnout today? This is a pretty good turnout today for such a tweaky subject. How many we got here?
We like Tweaky.
Tweaky and geeky, yeah. Yeah, so this is obviously something we've been kind of talking about and working on for a long time here. I've been kind of playing with this for the longest time. I got kind of sucked into it and doing a lot of studio work in the 80s and, started dragging some of this sidechain work into my live work and honestly was driving sound companies crazy with it because, at that time it was all analog, obviously, and none of them had detector circuit or sidechain inputs in their patch bay, anything like this. I mean, it was just a solder fest to try to get signals going where I wanted to get them going to be able to deal with some of this sidechain stuff. So obviously a lot easier in today's world in digital, and honestly it's part of the fun with it because we can take so much advantage of it in digital because we can easily patch those things, right? I mean, it's so easily accessible with your internal processing and your patch bay, all that stuff. It's so easy to do here. So we're going to go through a bunch of stuff today. I hope you enjoy this. So let me get the board back up and we'll get that going. Fred, thank you for telling me I'm muted. It could have been a long day without you telling me that. Share screen. Like I was trying to say, I just had kind of one of those mornings this morning where just apparently nothing was going to work today. So hopefully we'll get through this okay. All right, everybody set? Everybody ready? Here we go. This lab number 9, and we are going to talk about sidechain. It is all about sidechain or detector circuit. Let's just take a really quick poll. You can show me your hands in the participants thing there, and that'll give me some sort of read on this here. How many of you guys have taken advantage of sidechain when you're using some of your dynamics processors? I see Dave Stagel with the first guy with his hand up. I knew he was going to be in here. Yeah, that's really good. Glad to hear that. Glad to see that. All right, so you get some joy out of this today, and I want you to share. As I kind of said in the very earliest labs here, this is meant to be a cooperative here. I don't want to be just the talking head up here every week. So if you've got examples that you want to share with the attendees today, please feel free to do that. I'm going to lower your hands here. All right, here we go. Let's see if we can get it going here. All right, so this is part of a kind of a module that I teach in one of my classes, and been doing this one for a little bit. But I actually spent a little more time preparing some examples for you today, so we didn't have to make it just all what we're going to talk about. So, kind of the understanding of sidechain, if you're not aware of it, is that most dynamic processors, meaning gates, compressors, limiters, have access to this thing called the detector circuit, right? And the detector circuit is the signal that the dynamics processor is basing its work on. It's basing its envelope on. Obviously, you can adjust the way it responds to it with attack and release times, but this is a signal that you can make bring into the unit and make it react as a result of it, as opposed to just using the input signal. So in the normal setup, right, a copy of the input signal just goes to the detector circuit, and we work off of that envelope. Now, you can do some things with that on most compressors where you can high pass it, low pass it, create a peak in it, whatever you want to do to get it to drive that processor a little better. But you can also put your own signal in there, and that's when it starts to get fun. All right, so sidechain or detector circuit work offer that input, and you just have to access it. You'll be able to, on most units, especially gates, but most units today, certainly software units today, you can actually listen to that sidechain input, which we're going to do today to try to examine what we're doing with that. And they allow you to do it. All right, so here's your first example I'm going to give you here. Let's see if I can get my act together here and get an example ready to go. So even though we're in a time now where well, this isn't going good right out of the gate. Okay, yeah, that's right. All right, so one of the things you can do it very simply, and this is probably one of the early things that I kind of did with dynamics processors, especially compressors and stuff, was kind of build my own dynamic EQ. Now, this, I'll say up front, this isn't near as comprehensive as a lot of the dynamic EQs we have available today to us in plug-in. But before there was any of those plug-in devices, any of these really intensely built dynamic EQs that we have today, this was one way of doing this. And it was simply to put an equalizer between the input signal and the detector circuit, right? So, you would tap your source channel and bring it in. I usually used a third octave to do this because they were readily available when I was doing this in the early days. And then, you would, like, say, probably the place I used it the most often was on guitar solo channels, right? So, which is what I'm going to show you today. Where, you might have somebody who's playing a rhythm sound and it, you can get the tonality sorted out on that. And then as soon as they kick in all the drive and start picking aggressively, you can get some pretty pointy frequencies out of that guitar solo that can kind of get on top of you pretty quick. So this is a way of handling that, right? You're just going to boost up the offending frequency or frequencies in some cases on that guitar channel, and it's going to cause the compressor to react. Now, as what should be obvious here, if it's not, that frequency is going to make the entire signal compress. But the little insight that you have to it is, if you set the threshold right, only when that frequency is really happening is the compressor going to react. So kind of the net result of it is dynamic EQ. It's not, like I said, it's not near as comprehensive as what we have today, but this actually works, and I'm going to give you an example of it here. So let's just get right to it. I'm going to throw up a little. We had one song in the Tom Petty tour that Mike Campbell played, and he played this really bright, resonant guitar just for this one song, and I used to have to deal with this way on the song. So it's a song called Crawling Back to You. So I'm going to give you the guitar part here. Without any of this effect on it, just to give you an example of what it sounds like. Let me know on volume if this is too loud, too soft, whatever. Okay. So as you can see, it gets pretty wiry pretty quick, and in a big PA, that will get on top of you in a hurry. All right, so what I've done is taken this SSL bus compressor. I just chose it. I figured, well, it's as good as any will be able to work on it. Set with a fairly low ratio, and on the sidechain EQ, I'm basically doing this. Right, I've kind of identified this as the troublesome frequency on it, and I'm going to stick that into the sidechain. And you can see on the device here, I have external chosen, right? And up here in the patchability, I have a channel that has that, which is a copy of his guitar with this equalizer on it going into the sidechain. Okay, and I've got it set up on a fader here. Let me see if I can get that where you. I'll just ask you to trust me on it. I've got it on a fader where I can push this signal into the sidechain at any point if I feel like I need it, and it will tone down that frequency on it on the guitar. All right, so as you'll see here, I'm going to run it one more time. Just watch the metering on it. You will see no gain, no compression happening on it until I push in this sidechain signal. Okay, so let's just run a little bit again. Okay, I'll stop there, and this time I'm going to push in the sidechain signal on it and listen to the different effect of it. All right, so I'm going to start it again, and I'll take the sidechain signal in and out of it a couple of times here so that you can kind of hear it. All right. And like I said, you know, in plugin world, we got some kind of better choices to do this, but this is definitely an effective way to do it. All right. Right, so you kind of get the idea, and you know you might have to use a little bit of makeup gain there once you get some that compression on it, but it definitely tones it down without really stomping on it too bad. You know, it's pretty good. All right. So you know, we'll just take these one at a time. Just do a couple questions on it. Scott Taylor, you got a question?
Yeah, so you were just compressing it. You weren't doing anything with the EQ deal because it to me just sounded like it was just a compression of the overall.
I know it sounds like that, but if you match the levels on it, it actually changes the tonality of it, and it's based on the attack and release of that that compressor, right? Because it's going to have what I've got it set up there, which is probably worth looking at here.
I mean, it took away a little bit of the grittiness. I heard that, but I was curious if it was the EQ part or if it was just basically compressing volume more so than anything.
It does compress volume overall, but only when that 6K peak is happening, right?
Gotcha.
Get your threshold set right there, and again, this is not a true dynamic EQ. You're kind of simulating it here, but take a look at the attack and release on that compressor, right? It's very fast in order to get that high frequency, and very quick release, right? So it's going to let go of it really quick as well. So if you get the threshold set right, where really, and I was a little deep on the threshold here. I'll be totally honest. But it will have a tendency to push that signal back when that 6K thing is happening, right?
Gotcha.
So just you know, I put this one in there as much as anything just to kind of get the concept across. I think this is a good concept of it. If I was doing it today in digital, there's much better tools to do this where you can get some actual dynamic equalization built into that, right? So we got tons of great tools at our disposal today to do that. All right, so I got lots of button pushing to do today. Here we go. All right, so let's see here. Ready? Okay. So here's another one for you, and this one I've been using for a long time. This was one I started doing really early on in live sound, and it was honestly in analog. It was such a bitch to hook it up, but it worked so great. I decided to keep doing it, and it's very easily done. I mean, incredibly easily done in digital now. It's kind of a master-slave gate, right? I use this almost, dare I say, religiously on inside kick and outside kick mic, and snare top and snare bottom mic, right? Because I'm sure we have all had this situation where, you know, if you put a gate on the outside mic, as soon as the drummer drops down a dynamic where he's just tapping on the bass drum, you can't get that gate to open up. You get no puff out of that outside drum. And a similar thing on the snare drum, where if the guy drops down to a low dynamic on the snare drum, it won't open up the snare bottom gate. So the idea is that you take the kick in signal and send it to the gate that is on the kick out, right? That becomes the trigger signal. And then likewise for the snare bottom gate, you trigger it from the snare top mic, right? That way, almost no matter where he goes dynamically, it's going to open that gate. You know, you can get your threshold set much easier here. Also kind of takes that idea of, you know, the bass drum bleeding into the snare bottom mic and giving you false opens of that gate. Almost completely eliminates that, you know, because it's all based on the top mic now. Kind of get the idea there? So, you know, I got this one up here as well. I'll give you this one as an example just to kind of show you. And I'm going to give you a really extreme example of it here. I remember I had these tracks. It's a show I recorded for Ben Montench where we had a drummer who brought a bass drum that had no access to the inside of it. Completely covered front head and, you know, and back head, obviously. But there was no way to put a mic inside the drum. He was not going to allow us to do it. So it was a front mic and a beater side mic, and you'll hear it here. So, but you know, doing this kind of thing absolutely saved me. I was able to get a pretty good sound with this. I mean, it was not your normal bass drum per se, but let's see if I can get this up here. Stand by for me one sec. Yeah, here we are. All right, so I'll audition the parts for you here, and I'm just using the internal gating here with its particular abilities to choose sidechain here. So let's start with the bass drum. It was the obvious one. All right, so if you can kind of see on the screen there, maybe I'll annotate this so you can see it. Man, I'm rusty. I've been away for a couple weeks here. All right, so as you can see, I got the gate involved here, and right here is where you choose what the trigger source is going to be, right? So the sidechain is engaged, and I've chosen kick in, and I've taken it at the top of the channel, right? So, and you can kind of pick and choose where you take this from depending on your application, but I just took it from the top of the channel. I didn't want necessarily any equalization that I was going to do to affect the ability to trigger the gate. So. And as you can see here, I don't really have a ton of depth on it. I got this down about 10, 15 dB, and certainly with gates, that's one of the secrets to using them is not trying to make them on-off switches. You actually want to make it more like fader moves here. All right, so let me see if I can play some audio here. Okay, so this is the kick in. And it's really not a kick in here, right? This is just on the beater side of the microphone. This is literally just a microphone thrown in there on the back side of the drum, right? All right, so now I'll give you the outside mic. So that's the outside. There, so you can kind of see the envelope happening there. And if you listen to both, now I'm going to take the gate off here so you get some sense of what's happening there. And here it gets kind of woolly and kind of out of control. And with a in a good sized PA with these two open mics, getting a bass drum sound without doing this is nearly impossible. Get it back in here. See, I got a little bit of compression on that outside mic there too, but the sidechain is the big ticket item here. Okay, so a similar kind of thing with the snare drum here now. Let's go to the snare drum. This is the snare. This is the snare bottom. And again, I don't really have a ton of depth on that. You can hear a lot of noise in that until we put the gate in. And we could make that a little deeper if we wanted to do it. And once we add the snare in there with it, all right, so I mean, it actually just kind of cleans it up really easily, and it becomes so much easier to gate once you have those, kind of strong impulses that are doing the triggering of it, right? Right, so that's no inside mic at all on a bass drum there, so you can get it working. It just takes a little bit of work and a little bit of cleverness to get it going, right? I also did something very similar to this on Matchbox 20 when I was working with them. At one point in the show, we had one drum kit, a second drum kit that we did in a very ambient miking scheme. I just basically did it with three U67s, believe it or not. We took them on tour. And I had another, like a 421 that was just kind of off of the snare. We were trying to create some really ambient stuff there. But I actually used some triggers on the actual snare drum, which we'll see here in just a minute, to actually trigger a gate on that 421 to make it sound like a little more like a snare and actually add it to that ambient mics. And I was just shocked how good that worked. I did a similar thing for the bass drum where I had an inside 91 but it was only used as the gate on the outside bass drum mic, and I was shocked at how good that worked. Scott, go ahead.
On that side chain area,
Yeah.
is there anything else to that, or is it literally you just pick your key source where you want your pick off and turn it on and then it goes? I mean, is there any more to that?
Yeah, there's nothing else you have to do to it there. Matter of fact, I meant to listen to it there. Let's give it a listen. Stand by.
I'm not at the shop today. I don't have the console in front of me, so I haven't really played with it yet. So
Yeah. All right, so let's go back to that here for a second. Let me see if I don't know if I've got it set up where you guys hear my solos. Stand by here. Doesn't sound much. I'm gonna. Let me check something. Oh yeah, there we can hear. You guys can hear that, right? So I'm listening to the side chain there, so you can hear the actual top snare coming into that unit there, right? And that's the actual gate happening. So let's do a similar thing for the bass drum there. So here's the kick out mic. And if I listen to the side chain there, sorry, I had the actual bass drum in there too. So there's the side chain signal. And you can EQ that up if you want to use the filters to make it a little more of a point, etc. You can certainly do that as well there. That certainly doesn't hurt sometimes.
I got a continuation on that question too.
I'm sorry, say that again. You kind of broke up there.
I got a continuation on this question as well too. Whenever you're done.
Yeah, go ahead. Go.
From what I'm seeing, and granted, even the times that I've mixed, I don't usually use a lot of side chains, so I never really paid much attention to them. I know what they do, what they're capable of doing, but at least on this console, is it always tied with the expander gate and comp limiter, or is there a way of using a side chain without it? Because I don't think I ever really knew that it had to be tied with a comp limiter or an expander gate.
Every one of the comp limiter expanders that are on the console offer that ability. But remember, even if you don't use the side chain, the input signal will be the side chain. You're just, when you actually deploy a side chain input, you're replacing that input signal as the side chain. Right? You follow me there? There's always, my point is, there's always a side chain signal there. You're just going to dictate which it is at this point.
Is that the way they always work, and they're always designed across the board?
Yeah. All compressors and gates would work that way because it's got to have some signal to make the gate work. So normally, like I said in the first slide there, it's just a copy of the input signal. But here we're going to say, well, I don't want it to be the input signal. I want it to be something that's going to dictate a little different action here.
That makes sense. I just never really paid that much attention to it on that slide. So that's actually good. I didn't know that.
That's why we're here, Scott. Right? Sorry, didn't mean to be glib about it.
No,
all
that's
right.
Great. I appreciate it.
Let's get back to our drawings here. All right, so that's master-slave gating. You can do, just use your imagination there to get what you want to do. I just think drums is probably the easiest example to show that. Obviously, in these situations, again, I'll try to encourage you, probably when I see guys really not having much success gating, usually they're trying to make the gate too deep, right? They're trying to make on-off switches. And it's like, if you just treat it more like a fader move, where you're smart enough to push up that fader right before the gate or right before the signal happens. And then when the signal is done, you turn it back down. That's the kind of feel. That's when you're going to have the most success and not have these gates chirping all over the place at you in your mix, So just keep that in mind as we go forward here. All right, here's another one for you. Triggered drum gates. Right, I've used this one for ages, and this actually helped me learn a little bit more about triggering drums. So, let's see if I got it there. Yeah, on Petty. Hang on, let me get my example up here. I started deploying this in my early days with Petty because Steve Ferroni was such a gorilla on the drum kit. Oh, I'm sorry, Fred. Do you need a question on that last segment there?
I just had a question. So if you have any processing post the input, you're going to have a little bit of delay. So that trigger actually could happen, like you said, before it actually got there, right? So you're not. A lot of times with gates, in the broadcast, they're really hard to use because it takes away part of the input.
Right.
But in this situation, because you're processing down the line and you have the latency, you actually could open that. You could have that trigger happen just slightly before you needed it to.
Yeah, which is a good thing. You almost create your own look ahead that way.
Yeah, look ahead. Yeah, cool.
Yeah, we used to do exactly the same thing in the studio by taking the trigger, or taking the drum input that was going to do the trigger from a different part of the tape machine, from the earlier tape head. I mean, it's the same principle,
That's
taking
cool.
it from the repro head, So, yeah. It's that kind of an added bonus to digital. There is where digital latency actually helps us. What? All right. So trigger drum gates. So, like I was saying, I started doing this early in my days with Petty because Steve was such a gorilla on the kit, and I mean, he played crash cymbals and crash ride as loud as anybody I ever heard. So it became kind of really challenging to get the gates to stay in control and not open unexpectedly on tom-toms especially. So I kind of coaxed him into this idea of putting piezo elements inside each one of the tom-toms, and then through the breather hole feeding a cable out that had a 1/4-inch connector on it, and we just dedicated a couple of channels to it. There was one for rack tom, floor tom, second floor tom. So I had 3 additional channels on the console that carried those triggers in, and then those triggers were used to open up the gates, right? Because they were going to be completely isolated. They were inside the drum. Matter of fact, they were mechanically connected to the drum. So even if he just, played side stick on the rim, it was going to open up the gates. So it worked absolutely fantastic. Now, like I said, it actually taught me a little bit about drum gating, where I learned kind of a method for using the high pass and the low pass filter on the sidechain to actually create something that sounds very much like the trigger and actually reacts very much like it. So even if you don't have this situation where you could put these triggers in place, if you use the high pass and the low pass very effectively, you can do the same thing. So I'll show you that here. Let me make sure I got my audio happening here. Let's see. Oops. Why don't I hear you? Stand by for me. This is going to go to this. I think I hear someone's vacuum cleaner. Oh, sorry, my bad here. All right, so I've taken these 3 toms and panned them out a little bit left to right so you can hear which one's doing which. All right, so let's take a listen to, actually let me get this up where you can see it. Push up the... All right, so there's the first rack tom that you see there, and you'll notice right next to it, I've got another signal that is called rack 1 trigger. Right? That's that piezo element coming into the console. And if I go back to that rack 1, you'll notice that the sidechain source is not in right now. I'm going to go ahead and put it in. All right, so if I go to listen here, check out what that trigger sounds like coming into the gate. Turn this on. Right? So, yeah, nice and pretty, right? It's really nice and pretty. But it's effective. You know, it's just this little pickup, the little round pickup that we put inside the drum to be able to do that. And, you know, you have to gain it up. Now, the beautiful part of it that came along with it is that we would record these triggers as well. So the guys in the studio, when they would go into remix live stuff, they had those trigger pulses available. If they were using gates, they didn't want to write automation or do all the edits. They could just put a noise gate on there, put the trigger in, and off they go, you know. So let's listen to the key source when it's not an external sidechain, right? So this is, let me just do this here. I'm going to put this back to self, and we'll listen. Now you can hear what I've done is actually, through the use of high pass and low pass, created a very, very narrow peak here, right? And you can see that it's working just as good as the piezo, really, because it's got all the top end, all the low end shelved out of it. It's just really this kind of 1K little gook that will open up that tom there. So same effect though, right? So that's that guy, and this, I got this right, is the trigger. So that's the internal using the high pass and the low pass. And this is the actual trigger. Yeah, distorted like crazy. Probably overdriving that little piezo element like nobody's business, but it works. So again, just using sidechain really effectively there to really help you with your tom gates, right? And then just set your attack and release accordingly. Dave Stagel, so good to hear from you. How are you, man?
I'm good, man. How are you doing?
Doing good. Doing good.
That's good. One thing I want to add while you're talking about using triggers, because I've done a lot of this after stealing it from you. And one of the things that I noticed right off the bat when I started using them was all of my release times on the gate had to be different because the sustain of the drum is going to be a lot longer than the sustain on that trigger. So it'll feel all kinds of wrong and weird when you try and do it at first, but you just have to, adjust it by ear and play with that hold and release and get it fine-tuned.
Yeah. And the nice thing about that is you can actually dictate at that point how long the drum is lasting.
Right.
Right? And very effectively do that. Once you've got that information closed down, all that bottom end that's out of the trigger source now the drum itself is actually dictating, and you are dictating how long that drum rings, right? So if just for, I think for probably just good argument here, let me take a look at, if you take a look at my floor toms here versus the rack tom, let me get that annotated where you can see where I'm looking here. Stand by. Nice point, Dave. Thank you, man. Good one. All right, so look here. Oops. Like I said, I'm out of practice, man. I need some reps. So this is that envelope that you're actually adjusting on the drum now, right? So if you take a look at my rack tom, obviously it's shorter. It's going to be shorter in terms of ring time than the floor tom, right? Release time there is about a little over 300 milliseconds. We go to a floor tom. Notice it jumps up to almost 700 milliseconds, right? And same thing with floor two. Floor two is really long. I've got that set up a little over a second in the release time, which honestly is probably a little long. As I was listening to it there, I was thinking that sounded long. So, but now you have really good control over how long those drums last. And you could, if you wanted to be really picky about it, change those depending on tempo of song. Like if you had somebody that was doing a lot of tom-tom stuff in a really fast song, you might want to really close those down much quicker than you currently do, right? Okay. All right, so that's kind of triggered drum gates. Now, here's the other cool part about that. If you're using those kind of things, even though it's very difficult to do this, I've lost more hair and turned more hair gray trying to do this kind of work. Now that you have a trigger source for the gates, you also have a trigger source for a sound if you want to do it. If you've got a sound module and you want to trigger it, well, your trigger is sitting right in the console now, right? So, you could put one of those in the bass drum, you could put one in the snare drum, and get away with it as well. Yeah, Martin Fry, go. Good to hear from you too, man. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, good to be here, Robert. Yeah, I've had a lot of success actually with that exact technique. Just a quick question here. Am I crazy, or do I recall that some analog gates of yesteryear also referred to the sidechain input as a key input? Do I remember that correctly?
You do remember that correctly. Yeah, that's right.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and actually, if you look on the venue screen, next time I bring it up, I'll show it to you. It's labeled as key source, right? So key input, key source, yeah, all of those are synonymous with one another.
Oh, yeah.
Detector circuit, side chain, all same thing.
Cool. Thank you.
You bet. All right, so here's kind of a look at one style of piezo that you could put on there. I moved away from this. I tried this for a little bit, and it was a little too invasive to the actual drum sound. So we started sticking them on the shell. We actually put them inside the shell, but this is very similar to what I was using on Petty. So, total pain in the ass to do it. Drum tech absolutely hated my guts for it. Had to cut the end off of it, stick the end through the breather hole on the drum, get a soldering iron up there, resolder it on, and attach it to the drum. Total pain in the ass, but totally worth it. Totally worth it at the time. And as you see in the bullet point there, you can actually, once I learned to do it, you can actually achieve a very, very similar result using the high pass and the low pass. It's probably even a little better quality signal for the source. All right, let's move on to another. Yeah, this is a fun one and a challenging one to do, but it does work, and I'm going to try to give you an example of this one too. Let me just go ahead and blow this all out so you can see it, and then I'll get the thing up. This is using either compression or ducking to deal with audience mics a little bit, so you can have a little bit more ambience in your recordings, etc., and not have a whole lot to do. Not to have your hand on a audience VCA or anything like that. It's a little tricky to set up. Let's see here. I'm here. Yes. But it does work. And again, subtlety is kind of the key here. If you try to make this big fader moves of your ambience and audience up and down, it's probably not going to work. But if you get a good ambient setting that feels all right with the mix in there, and then you just use this to pull it down 2 or 3 dB, maybe 4, somewhere in there, and let it breathe back and forth and attack and release back and forth, this can actually work. So I'm going to give you a very exaggerated example of it today. So let me get the parts and pieces up here where you can hear it. There's a lot of ambience mics in this mix, so it should reveal it pretty well. Let me just test myself here.
All right, thank you. Thank you. We're going to do, this one is also from Wildflowers, and we never play this one too often, but I'm really glad we're going to tonight. It's one of my favorites, and
okay, stand by for me. Make sure my signal's getting there.
all right, thank you. All right, thank you.
Okay, so what we got going on here is I've got it set up where the audience is going to get pushed back once the band comes in. Okay, so and I usually kind of do it this way if I'm going to do it, where when the vocalist, like Tom, is speaking right there, it actually sounds nice and ambient, right? I mean, it doesn't sound dry and kind of closed down. It sounds like he's in a big place. But then once the band comes in, I really want it to just pull back a little bit and get a little drier and settle in a little bit where you can actually hear what's going on in the mix and not have it be so much of the ambience, all right? So similar sort of process here. Gotta get this up. All right, so this is right. This is my Ducker circuit, or my Ducker that I have on this audience group, and my sidechain from this is a blend. It's a matrix that has got my music stuff in it. Let me see if I can find it here. There we go, audience key. So I'm working off of stems right now, but I would normally do this off of my subgroups on the console. So you can see that I got a blend of drums, bass, the guitars, the keys, but no vocals are triggering this at this point, right?
All right.
Signal there. Okay. All right, so we'll go back to this, and I'll let you listen to just, maybe before we start this, we'll listen to just the music, just the ambience, then the two together, and hopefully get a sense of what's going on here.
All right. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, so here's just the dry mix. Let's see my piece. There it is.
We're going to do this one is also from Wild
So this is
Flowers.
just the ambience.
We don't play this one too often, but I'm really glad we're going to tonight. It's one of my favorites, and
this will be both now.
hope you like it too. It's called Crawling Back to You.
And as you should hear, it's going to be way overly ambient. I'm going to mute the ambience here. So I'll start that again, and this time we put in the sidechain. You can watch the sidechain signal come in right at the top of this unit and dictate the depth that it's going to go down. Now I've got this pushed way down because I want it to be somewhat dramatic here.
Wild Flowers, and we never play this one too often, but I'm really glad we're going to tonight. It's one of my favorites, and hope you like it too. It's called Crawling Back to You.
So that's dry. And this is with the pushback in.
Waiting by the side of the road for day to break so we could go down into Los Angeles with dirty hands and worn out knees.
Right? Kind of getting the idea there? So, obviously the band mix has got to be there to push that signal down a little bit. But the beautiful part of doing it with, I think, especially with a Ducker, although some compressors can kind of simulate this today, is that you can set up an attack time and a release time and a hold time, right? So you can make that very much like a fader move if you're doing it right, right? So it's a nice way to just have your recordings, your two-track recordings. I mean, this would probably work really good in a stream. Sound ambient when they need to, right? As opposed to just trying to find one level for your ambience that is kind of just the average over time. It takes a little time to set up. I'm going to warn you ahead of time and kind of get dialed in. But especially if you're on a tour where your console's pretty consistent night to night, you can get this to work really, really well. So, like I said, you can use a compressor to do it. I don't think it's quite as effective or quite as graceful as the Ducker. You got to be, you just got to kind of be cautious of how you do it. In terms of what ratio you use, versus how much you push into the compressor to do it. But you could do a very, very similar thing. Like I've seen a lot of guys use this exact method where a vocal is the side chain and the band mix is on the ducker or on the compressor, right? So as soon as the vocal's singing, it will push back the mix by however much time, right? Or how much level. You know, and it doesn't take much in that setting. Like if you're using this as kind of an auto mixer to have a vocal push back your music mix a little bit, I'm telling you, a dB and a half of depth can have a huge impact on it. So you don't have to get real, medieval with it, real forceful with it. Just let it really just subtly breathe off of that vocal. Now, the other challenge that comes with it in that situation is if you have tons of background bleed into your vocal, you have to be careful with it, right? If you leave that vocal mic open, when they're in an instrumental or whatever, the instrumentation is going to get pushed back from the bleed, right? So you got to be careful with it. I would almost always in that situation make it post fader, right? When I push up the vocal and it pushes back my band mix a little bit, that's fine. As soon as I pull down that fader, the band mix comes back where it was, etc. Just use your attack, hold, and release times to set that up to be really graceful. You'd be amazed how good that works, right? I think, if I remember right, I think I saw a thing where Pooch was doing a thing with the mid side on one of the Waves plugins to create a similar thing. Hey, Dave Stegel, are you familiar with that? Have you watched him do that? Is he doing that kind of thing?
I have not.
Do you know about that plugin?
I don't know which one he would have used. I mean, I'm trying to think which of the Wave stuff has mid-side in it. Some of their mastering compressors.
I think it is one of their
have
mastering compressors, if I remember
You
right.
can do that. Any compressor that has a range control on it can kind of work for instead of using a ducker, because then you can dictate exactly how much it'll go, because you just don't want it tied to a ratio is usually the way I looked at it.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think I actually have this one inserted on this bus as well. This is the Pro compressor I have it, and it has a depth control, right?
Yeah,
where you could get out of
depth or
ratio.
range.
Yeah, similar thing. Like I said, there's a lot of good tools to do that today. But if you're in a situation where you got some time to set that up, it works pretty good. It works pretty doggone good. All right, where do we go from here? So a little bit of an auto mixer there, right? So again, just side chaining, doing some nice things there. How about some gated reverb effects, right? I mean, the beautiful thing about, man, these consoles we have today. I mean, we got noise gates on every channel. I mean, you can easily create your own kind of gated effects here, right? Just by triggering it from whatever you want to the gate to open it, right? So let me see if I can get this example up here. 1 second here. I've been making great use of this. I love doing this kind of stuff with a few things that I have here. So let's go back to that really open drum kit that I had here. We'll use that as an example here. Let me just make sure I got this together here. Yeah. All right, so this would just be, this won't be the greatest of examples, but you'll get the idea. Let me get this in here. So we'll get the drum kit open. I'll identify a few things here for you before we get started. All right, so this is that drum kit that I was showing you earlier that had the closed bass drum. And we're going to add a little bit of plug-in ambience to that. All right, so let me just start it.
All right, thank you.
Oops, not you. Stand by. I got to get that recall. Actually, I'll do this. I think if I do that and then do this. Yep, stand by on that. Sounds like I got some pink noise going on somewhere. Hang in there for the engineer. See if I can get it right here. Where are you? Uh-huh. Okay, here we go. All right, so this is the ambience that I have on this. And it's kind of tight anyway, but as you can hear, okay, so that's just the ambience. All right, so we're going to actually open that ambience up a little bit and only gate it from the snare drum now. All right, so we're going to go to this device. So you can see that I got a kind of a small bright room on this here. And we're going to open it up. And I'm going to go to the input here now and notice that I've got the snare top set up as a side chain on it. Oh, gate in play. There we go. All right, so at this point now, we only have the snare opening the ambience, right? Even though if I take this off, there's all drums going to it. Oops. I put the gate on it and the side chain. So you get a little better. Kind of getting the idea there? So that's a reverb processor that we've just put a gate on. And you know, it's kind of, I'll give you a little trade secret here. I know this from talking to a bunch of mixing engineers that do this kind of thing a lot. And I can note some, or mention some pretty notable albums where this is done, where instead of just putting a gated reverb on something, they'll do something very similar to this, but run the reverb time out very long, like 1, 2, 2.5 seconds, and then gate it down, because they're taking advantage of the front end of that really long time and adding that with the drum. That was a very, very popular thing to do in the 80s and early 90s for drum sounds. It still works today, you know, where you make that time really long, but only use the first, 600, 700 milliseconds of it as a function of the gate, because the snare is opening it up. You can dictate the release, attack and release time on it. Yeah, Scott, go ahead.
So you might have just gave me a revelation, but no, seriously, there's things that you do that I've always wondered how people are doing it, and I think you're answering a lot of those questions. But so what you're doing, rather than just like for example, like if I were to mix, what I typically do is I'll just
Gate your phone?
yes, sorry, I had a phone call.
Right.
I will add reverb onto my gated drum, whatever it is, toms or snare, any of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And I'll just leave it at that. But what you're doing is you're actually taking that reverb and side chaining it to your, like, did I miss something? Did you end up holding or changing something where I missed hearing what the difference was?
No, that's exactly the thing. The big difference there is that the snare drum is the only thing ends up with reverb on it there. even though all the drums were going to it. You know, it was kick, snare, toms, everything, right? So that reverb was on all of those things. But once I sidechain it by the snare drum, then only the snare drum is going to have the reverb on it, because it's only going to open the gate on it when the snare hits, right? Now, if you still wanted the gated effect on the kick, the snare, and the toms, then you create a bus that is going to go into that sidechain that's got the kick, snare, and toms in it, right? Then it's really not all that much different, other than you're changing the envelope of the reverb now, right? Because there's a noise gate on the reverb return. Did you pick that up?
So you're using one reverb for all of them, tom, snare, everything, but then you're just tightening it up by doing the side chain on the snare.
Yeah, in this situation, I can tell you, I've absolutely done this a ton of times within the course of a mix or the course of a night. There may be songs where I have reverb on all the drums, like we have right now, and then there might be a song where I say, oh no, I want the toms and the kick drum to go much drier, but I still want that kind of ambience on the snare. I just sidechain the gate on the reverb with the snare.
Right, and then let me guess, you throw that into a snapshot when you're mixing.
You got it there, big guy. You got it.
Starting to connect it all.
Yeah, yeah. So, obviously it takes some advanced work on it. You're not going to do that necessarily on the fly. But, I'll tell you something. I always have that available to do that on my reverbs. There's always a gate that's set up kind of that way, and if I want to decide to do it quickly. The other place that I do it, let's see if I can show you this one as well. This one kind of surprises people when I show them that I do this sometimes. Let me see if I can get to this one. Hang on one second here. Mute this down so we don't hear that coming back.
Well, see, even there, I feel stupid now because I've never thought of really gating my overheads.
Yeah, which is exactly where I'm going right now, right? So, but keep in mind, I treat overheads a little differently than a lot of people treat it. I have overheads, and I have an overhead mic that is a room mic, right? I don't necessarily treat those two things exactly the same. Now, if I have a situation where I can't put up that kind of center room mic over the kit, then if I can still do it on the overheads and get the same effect. Okay, so check it out. I'll let you listen to it here. Let me make sure I got it up where we can hear it. Should do this.
I know it probably sounds like I don't do a lot of mixing, but it's just little techniques that I just never had the opportunity to mess with.
Oh, that's totally right. That's totally right. Yeah, stand by for me. I just got to. All right, so I'm going to turn off everything except for the overhead here. All right, so this is obviously wide open, and this is that one that's right over the top of the kit. This is an XY microphone. Actually, I may not be able to do it with this take. 1 second, bear with me here. Actually, that should be right. Yeah, okay, hang on. It's just me. I just got the wrong channel in there. Should be that guy. All right. Right. So sorry, I didn't set that up previous to this example, but you kind of get the idea there, right? So that I'm just gating down that microphone now that I use for ambience over the kit. Right? I don't use it for anything other than that. Now, you could send this off to drum reverbs if you wanted to do it.
So can you hear me?
Yeah.
So if you're doing this, though, it sounds like you're basically shutting down everything else but the snare almost with those overheads. What's the point of that? Because, I mean, wouldn't you want to get a little bit more of your cymbals? Because that's typically what overheads end up picking up a lot of.
I've got other overhead mics that are picking up those cymbals. That's what I'm saying. Those are two different miking schemes there, right? One is an ambient mic, and then there are two that are outside for cymbals, and they're still drum mics, but they would pick up all the cymbals, right? So here, I'll let you listen to both here. What's that?
This is your XY in the middle.
Yeah. And there's
Okay.
other ways to use this too, which I'll talk about here in just a second. So, all right, so here's the regular overheads. And here's that one that's above the kit. And here's both. Kind of get the idea there? So it's a way of expanding, really. I mean, for all intents and purposes, the definition of what you're doing is you're putting expansion on the snare drum right there. You're making a lot more snare drum happen compared to the surrounding noise of the kit there. Now, on that overhead gate, and again, it's very similar to what I just showed you on the ambience. And again, I do this with program change. Sometimes the snare and the toms will both open up that ambient mic. Sometimes it's just the snare. It just kind of depends on what the song is telling me to do there, right?
Hey, Robert, question. What is your, I guess, your time alignment scheme between your direct snare mic, your cymbal overheads, and your overhead, ambient overhead? Are you doing something to try and time align all that, or are you purposely not doing that so you can actually add more ambience with the delays?
Yeah, and this is just me. I'm not saying this everybody has to do it this way. It's just my choice to do it this way. I like the spacing element of the overheads. I don't delay my close mics back to it. Okay. Now, that said, because I've got 4 channels of microphones spaced over the kit, what I do is pay very, very close attention to the arrival time of the snare drum to all of those microphones. Right? And it's actually coming up in a lab. I'm going to show you how I do it using Smart. But, once I have it set up, then what I absolutely want to guarantee is that when the snare drum arrives at any one of those microphones, it comes in at exactly the same time and the same phase response. That way, all of those mics can collapse down to 1, and it doesn't affect my snare sound at all. And in addition, if I have those things panned out, it will ensure that the snare drum is dead center in that left-right spread, because the arrival time is the same in all of them now, right? And that, to me, that's the most important piece of it. That's really, the kick and the snare are really the only things you have centered on your mix anyway, for the most part. You have stuff spread out. You want the spread on the overheads because you want to experience where the toms are actually placed, etc. But I pay very, very close attention to that arrival time of the snare to each one of those overhead positions, right? And you'll hear it here probably. I'll give you the rest of the kit with the overheads here. So I'll just mute the overheads here. Right. I mean, I like the life that it kind of gives to the snare drum, when that's going on there. I like doing that. Now, it doesn't necessarily require that you have a super quiet stage to do that, but you have to be aware of it. I mean, if you've got a ton of stuff coming into your drum monitors that are blowing up into the overheads, it's challenging to do, Yeah, Jeff Mayer.
Yeah, just to clarify, you're measuring these mic distances from snare to your overhead mics. That's how you're ensuring the same arrival times and all that.
If I tell you now, then I give away the next lab. I mean, No,
My bad.
I actually use Smart to do it.
Cool.
So the way I do it is I'll just give you the how do TV people say it? We're going to tease the event here. We're going to tease the event. So I actually have a snare drum that's got a powered speaker and a smart interface built into it. All right. Put the snare drum in the snare drum place. Turn on the pink noise. Use one of the mics and store a trace, and then start moving other microphones until you get the phase traces to lay right on top of each other. And once you do that, then you know they all arrive at the same time.
So you could get close by measuring, but not that close.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you something. I used to think I was getting it close until I started actually measuring it, and then I started realizing how poor I was doing it, you know. And honestly, it was a couple of things. Like I started listening to my recordings, for one thing, you know, the breakdown of the multi-track, and I think, wow, why is my snare drum so close to the high, you know, the overhead that's on the hi-hat side? Why is it, you know, my snare image would be out of whack? And it's like, well, that distance can't be right. They can't be equal if I'm doing that, you know. And, you know, it's one of those things where, and I've seen guys do this all the time, and I'm guilty of it as well in my early days, of looking at the drum kit and getting the overheads positioned where the drum kit, and you usually do it on the bass drum, is perfectly spaced between them. Well, the snare drum is not sitting there. Snare drum's actually a little more off to one side, and to get the snare to line up in those overheads is actually a little tricky. I've got it now where I've done it enough times in Smart, I kind of know what the look needs to be, you know. But if I have the time, I always check it. I've come up with a way to be able to put it up and check it within a couple of minutes and make sure it's okay, you know. But that's, again, that's using overheads as drum mics. You know, I mean, it's not just cymbal mics at that point. The cymbals are part of it, certainly, but it's not used as strictly as cymbal mics. I'm relying on that overhead and that ambient mic as drum sound, right? You with me there?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. All right, let's, sorry, go ahead, yeah.
You might have just answered this, but that's why I think I never ever tried doing gates on my overheads, because if I understand correctly, which you probably just answered it, your overheads that you've gated are now going to arrive at different times. Because like if you gate a snare, you gate a tom, you know, those, when you hit each one, it's its own entity. But with these overheads, they're picking up everything. So when you hit like a gated tom or gated snare, it's going to hit at a certain time, and then you're also going to have your overheads picking it up. So that's probably what you're talking about, right? Where you're having to align those so you don't have like this phasing and comb filtering crap going on?
No, not necessarily there, because keep in mind, you know, if I've got a spaced pair of overheads, the difference in arrival time of the actual drum, of a tom-tom up to those, is what's going to dictate where you think it's placed, right? If there's a tom-tom over on this side, it's going to be louder in this mic, and it's going to pull your attention over there when he hits it, and you're going to think, oh, that microphone is on that side, or that drum is on that side, right? So that's how, that's all taking place there. But yes, those, like a close mic tom and an overhead mic tom, are going to arrive at the console at different times. And I usually try to match those pan positions. But I'm okay with that comb filtering happening there. I actually like how that sounds. I like what it does to the bottom end and the mid-range. Okay,
Which is that open area.
What's that?
Which is that open area you like, the ambient
Yeah,
sound.
yeah, I like that. So, you know, if you guys want to do it, if you want to delay your close mics back up to your overheads, by all means, go right ahead. It's just, that's not the approach that I'm trying to take on it. It's just not the sound I'm going for there.
Okay, so theoretically, you don't really have to do that. It's not something that's like, you know, a revelation of you need to do that, but then you have to, if you're going to do that technique of gating your overheads, you have to time align everything to the other mics. You can just gate
No,
and leave them open.
it's not dictating that at all. It's not dictating time alignment there at all. So by putting that gate on that overhead and side chaining it with the snare, it essentially becomes a snare mic now, not an overhead mic, because we're only ever going to hear it when the snare drum plays.
Right. Okay, cool.
But I'm not worried about that time alignment. I'm not.
Gotcha.
All right, Mark, bring it, my man.
Yeah, back to your ambient mic, overhead mic. Just a quick question here. Is that actually a stereo, Royer, or is it yes?
Yeah.
That's a big part of that imaging thing, because
Big time.
the distance from any other drum that's mic'd in the kit is always going to be individually the exact same distance to both capsules in that microphone.
Yeah, and that's kind of why I use that as an ambient mic. at times.
I
you know?
love the stereo overhead mic myself, just
Yeah.
for that reason.
But you know, in that I mean, I have the luxury of doing that because I have the stereo ambience up plus the overheads.
Right.
You know, so I can kind of pick and choose. Or I can make the whole thing ambient if I want to make it.
Yeah.
And do quite often. But if I got something like this kind of Led Zeppelin-y thing that is happening with Ferroni there, where the snare and kind of the vibe of, I mean, it's kind of a when the levee breaks vibe there. You can kind of create that there with that ambient mic if you can do it. Yeah, if you want to do
Yeah.
it. You know.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. All right. What else do we need to discuss there? I don't think there's too much, and we're going to be running out of time here. Good grief! Look at the time. Let's see where we're at on the discussion here. Yeah, I'll just talk you through this one because I actually didn't make an example for this one. I was trying to find some Matchbox 20 drum tracks and couldn't dig them up in time. But you know, we always kind of have this one. This is always kind of a negative effect of gating your snare top mic, right? Which I hardly ever do. Unless I really, really have to do it. I really, very generally do not gate my snare top mic. But if you do, and you know, if you have a lot of depth in that microphone, one of the artifacts of that will be when that snare opens and there's an open hi-hat being played with it, all of a sudden your hi-hat is going to come forward. You know, you're expanding the hi-hat, believe it or not. You're putting expansion on the hi-hat as well. Like that gate is not smart enough to go, oh, I'm only supposed to let snare drum through. Actually, what I'm going to let through is anything that is happening at the same time as the snare drum. And usually with a drummer that's playing really open hats, you'll get this big kind of pump of hi-hat when the snare drum opens, right? And you know, I think what we kind of normally do as a result of that is ride the hi-hat pretty low, and it just becomes this kind of quarter note hi-hat thing that happens. But you can actually address this if you want to do it by using a ducker on the hi-hat that is triggered by the snare top, right? And it's going to be a gated snare top here, so it actually helps you a little bit. So once you do that, and you take that gated snare into the hi-hat ducker, right? What is going to happen is when the snare happens, it's going to turn down the hi-hat, turn down the hi-hat, turn down the hi-hat. And that's going to allow you to actually push up the hi-hat to match the level that it is when the snare gate opens, right? So you get this, right? And it works pretty effectively. I was very skeptical about this one when I first kind of heard about it and thought about it, but I used it with Paul, the Matchbox 20 drummer, who was a basher. I mean, he was a total basher. And it really helped out. I mean, it really leveled things out very, very quickly. And again, I was doing that in analog, so I was driving my A2 crazy. Okay, no, here's what I want to do. I gotta put a gate, or I gotta put a ducker on the hi-hat. We need to trigger it by the snare. He's like, you want to do what? Yeah, Fred, go ahead.
Are you using this on your Zoom session? Because I hear you when you talk, your music comes down a little bit, kind of like the radio DJs use.
Yeah, I'm using a ducker that's keyed from my voice. That's audio coming to you guys. So yeah, that's exactly right. All right, let's go to the next one here. Oh yeah, okay, this is fun. This is fun. So we're going to build an auto fader here. And if you guys are you can kind of see this in the background. If you're wondering what this hunk of metal is here behind me, this was the first time I ever did this. And as I was putting together this lab, I thought, oh, I think I still got that box. I went over to my warehouse, and sure enough, it was there. So this is a custom designed box. And I'm actually going to go to the next thing to discuss what this was, because there's kind of urban legend about this, and I'll try to explain it all here. So in 1987, when I was doing Def Leppard, and we were doing shows in the round. This was heavy metal in the round, loud, in your face, in the round kind of thing. And we did fine with it in rehearsals because we didn't really rehearse it in the round. But once we got to the first show, I remember thinking, oh my God, I may not be able to do this, because what I'm going to explain to you was so bad. I mean, we kind of had to go into emergency mode and figure out something to solve this. Now remember, this is all pre-digital. This is, 1986, 87, right around there. So the challenge was we had 6 vocal mics on this stage. It's 360-degree stage, 6 vocal mics for 2 singers. And these singers could be anywhere on that stage at any given moment singing. And the truth of the matter is, it was primarily one singer, and the other guy kind of sang. So you couldn't just have all of these mics on a mute group and open them up whenever there was going to be a vocal part. You were opening up 6 vocal mics underneath a 360-degree loud PA system to get one vocal out of it. It was just not going to work. I mean, it just absolutely was not going to work. I mean, the mix just went to Canyonville the minute you opened up that stage. You know, I mean, it was crazy. So we had to come up with a way of doing this, and so I kind of conceived this idea, and a friend of mine named Wally Bigby, who was the technician on the tour, actually built this box for me to be able to do this. And the idea was we actually, again, there was no Amazon or anything at this point, so we kind of had to go to a jewelry store and say, hey, where do you guys get your burglar mats? You know, the kind of mat that you stand on when there's a gun pointed at your head, so that the police will come. So they gave us a couple vendors, and we went and ordered these burglar mats. So we put a mat at each one of these microphones, and then it came into this box, which we affectionately refer to as the Bigby trigger. And when you step on one of those mats, it sends out 100 hertz tone out of the output of it. And you bring that into your console and bring that tone into a gate, and it will open the gate. Right? So stand at the mat, it opens the gate that is on your microphone. Move to a different mat, that gate closes down, the next gate opens up on the mat. And I mean, the difference this made in my life was just unbelievable. And it worked really, really well. Honestly, the hardest part of it was finding good quality gates, because these mats are literally just a switch that are going to, close down as long as you're standing on it. And they didn't, survive the rigors of the road too well. But this overall kind of saved my life on that tour, and we were actually able to get a really, really good result out of it. And the cool thing about it was it kind of worked as a backup for the bass player, as he was on a headset. So if his headset ever went down, he just stepped up to a microphone and sang his parts. It worked out good. All I ever had to know was, okay, there's vocal coming, unmute the vocal mics. And I got to the point where I could just leave them open. I didn't even do vocal mutes anymore, because it was just one microphone. They were all off when they weren't singing, or when they were away from the mats. So that was the idea. So that's the box. We actually, on the second tour we did with them, I actually had Bob Bradshaw build a version of this, kind of using CMOS for the switching, which was a lot cleaner switch, etc. All right, so I thought I would just show you this. But really part of the reason I wanted to bring it in here and show it to you is that, of course, we had to do that in those days. You had to kind of build it and make it happen. But today, you could actually emulate this right on the console. You could do this very, very easily on the console. So let me get to the point where I can show you how to do this. I'm going to show you both of them.
Hey, Robert, the Dead did that back during the Wall of Sound days. The exact same thing.
That was the first time I ever heard about it. Yeah.
Right.
All right, so let's see. So I'm just going to use pink noise to do this. I don't have any vocals to simulate it or anything like this. So I'm just going to give you some pink noise here. And maybe I'll do this. Let's go here. These channels up there, you can see them. All right, so what you see in front of you there is this channel. Let's see here, where I can annotate it so you can clearly understand what's going on here. So we're going to be concentrating on these two channels right here. And the one to the right that you see the noise in, that's going to be our vocalist. Okay? Now I'm going to go ahead and do this as well, make it even a little more apparent here. Let's go to... post fader metering on the input. So we'll actually get to kind of see these gates in action here. Oops. Oh. Okay, so you can kind of see some or hear some noise now, right? Now, the noise that you hear right now is actually at the level that it would be when it was turned down, right? So this is the down level. This fader that you see here, this is the Bigby trigger. So, when I step on the mat, I actually got a foot switch here that I'm gonna simulate stepping on the mat. You will hear this fader open up, right? The gate on it will open up, and again, trying to create it very much like a fader move, just as if somebody was sitting there riding this fader up and down, right? So here comes our 100 hertz tone. I'm gonna step on it. Right, so you see, oops, I don't know if you can see the tone here. So there's the tone coming in, gate opens up, and then when I release it, it's just going to fade it back down. Singing, 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 singing. Step away from the mat, and it turns it down. Right? I mean, it's just beautiful, and this works for my money way, way better than some of these inline gates that I've seen, because they're on-off switches, and this works really good for guys in ears, and that was an important component of this when we did Leppard. We were one of the early adopters of ear mixes. We were doing ear monitors as well as big monitors as well, but they were trying the ear thing, and until we did this, having those backing vocal mics up in the ears was no go. Absolutely not. They just could not deal with it. But once we got this, then everybody was like, oh yeah, I can deal with that. No problem. So you kind of get the idea here of what's happening there. If you want to look at what's happening tone-wise here, the tone set up here. So I'll press the foot switch again, and you can see the tone come up. There's the tone, a bunch of harmonics in there. You don't really care about the quality of it here. Right? So you're just setting your depth here at how much down you want that fader. So, really what we're trying to create is, like if I was operating this fader, I would say, okay, I got a vocalist, we're singing. When he's done singing, I'm going to turn him down here. Singing, down. Singing, down, right? We're just doing it with the gate. Right? So how do we do this actually on the console? It's actually really surprisingly simple. So in this situation, we're going to move over to these other two channels here. Let me clear this out of here. So I've set up a version of it that is internal to the console, right? Right, so we're going to use these two channels this time. So the one on the right there is our signal, and we're going to set it up here. This is a tone that we've got coming into the console. So I'm just using the tone generator on the console here. So I've got a 100 hertz tone. You can use any frequency you want. I just use this because it was convenient. I wanted something that definitely had enough amplitude to do it. And then this channel on the left is actually our vocal. This is our vocal simulation, right? And what we're going to do is set up an event where we actually have that switch, an actual foot switch, turn on the channel next to it, right? And once it turns on that channel, that noise is going to go into the sidechain of the gate on our vocal. So it's exactly the same process. We're just using an external switch, right? So I don't have an external switch input here to do it on my console, so I'm just going to use a function switch today. But it's exactly the same process. You would just replace this function switch with one of these GPIO switches down here, right? So you could use the same sort of mat, same sort of foot switch, whatever you wanted to do this exact same thing. So notice, let me get this channel up. So notice the gate is on this channel. This is our vocal channel. See if I got it right here. Let's see if I did it right. Oops. All right, so here's our noise. And when I push the foot switch here, I'm going to be doing it with my finger here. You'll notice that it's going to make the noise come on. So there's the noise going into the side chain. You can see the envelope up on the actual gate itself. Right? So if you had mats or anything like that you wanted to do this with, you could use an external tone generator. I'm using the internal tone generator here into that channel and just side chaining it into the gate that is on that vocal, right? Fred, you have another question there, or is your hand still up there? Okay. Thanks, buddy. All right, so, sidechain, a lot of good stuff that can come out of that, right? Once you learn how to use those things, man, they can be a lifesaver. As you can see for me, if I wouldn't have had sidechain access on that Def Leppard thing, honestly, after about 2 or 3 gigs, I would have probably gone to the manager and gone, we need to go back to the end, dude. This is not going to work. I know I said it was going to work. It's not going to work, But it was a lifesaver. And as it turned out, we got just rave reviews on that tour for the vocal work we were doing. So it was nice to see. All right. Any questions there? I know we went way over today. We had I'm making up for lost time here. I got a 90-minute session here today. Good grief. Sorry about that.
Hey, Robert, I don't know if you ever mentioned it, but who came up with this whole idea of side chaining? Like, when did that, kind of the history of it, where did it come in?
Oh, man, it's been around for as long as I've known about any of these processors. It was, yeah.
You had all the crap you had to go through just to do it back in the old days on the analog consoles. Was it, obviously it was before you started doing stuff, right?
No, like I said, I got kind of turned on to it in the studio where it was, they would always have sidechain inputs available in the patch bay, et cetera, and you could build mults and buses to do sidechain work there. But, out in the live worlds, you were lucky if you had a patch bay, let alone a patch bay that carried all the sidechain inputs for the dynamics processors and made them available. It was just at that point, it was a wiring nightmare to get sidechain access and, do taps from signals. Like, how do I even go about getting, a snare drum to the key input of a gate in a normal analog rack? That alone was worth the time and money, just to figure it out. So all of those problems are gone now in digital. We can do all of this kind of work at the drop of a hat, in digital. But it was challenging in those days. Honestly, I had to take it upon myself because even my A2 at that point was going, dude, you're crazy. I'm not doing that. Forget it. I was like, well, give me a soldering iron and some cable, and I'll make it happen here.
So this is more of a studio techniques that played into live. This wasn't actually a live thing that started that way.
Not necessarily, no, but I certainly saw the value of it from working in the studio, no doubt about it. It just saved my butt many, many times on things. So yeah, no, I saw the value of it. It was just uncommon to see it in terms of interface and racks and live sound. You just wasn't available. You kind of had to make it happen.
You think it started in radio? Because that's where I've heard it.
Well, sure. It happened forever in radio where you had DJs that would talk over music and it would, automatically fade it and duck it down. So yeah, that's what I'm saying. That's why I know it's not new. It's been around forever.
That and supermarkets, all that background music.
Supermarkets.
Yeah, that was back in the analog days when they were doing that.
Yeah. Well, honestly, one of my first jobs as an audio guy, 1979, I was working for a sound company that did installs. And part of our job was to go maintenance restaurants where they did installs. Well, one of the primary things they put in was the microphone that would jump on top of the music and go, Mr. Scovill, table for 4. I'd go fix and repair those things, So, you got access to it and kind of knowledge about it early on. Now, at that point in 1979, did I have the epiphany of going, oh my gosh, that's the answer to all my live sound problems? No, I was just a technician fixing the stuff, So I didn't get it till I got in the studio. All right. Well, this was fun. Was it? Did you guys enjoy this? Was that fun? Yeah. It was fun to kind of put it together. It was time consuming to put it together. Luckily, I had some time to do it. But there's tons of stuff you can do. And honestly, with virtual soundcheck now, that's the answer to really sorting these things out and learning this stuff. You have so much chance to experiment and try things. I've even come across things that I thought would work that were just like, oh no, that's not going to work. But yeah, I would have, I didn't discover it until virtual soundcheck to get it.
Now that we can see that box over your shoulder, what's the red black things and all that stuff there?
All right, so I'll give you the tour here. Yeah, let's give you a tour. This was kind of cool. So this was an 8-channel box. It was available for 8 mats. So the idea is that the switch would come in here on the XLR. That's where the switch would plug in. Wally was smart enough to actually build a little test circuit in it. So if you flip the switch, there was a little buzzer here, which the buzzer's not working anymore, that would say, yep, that switch is working. That switch is working. There's actually a little test point here, so you could actually put a meter across it and actually see that the mat was working. And then the outputs of the keys came off of a CPC. It was a little 8-channel CPC here that we just ran down the snake, and they showed up at the monitor console and at the front of house console. We just treated them as inputs on the console, you know. So it worked out great.
Wally was quite genius level.
Oh, man, I miss Wally so much. He was so great to have on the tour. I mean, it was a blessing. Certainly in the Def Leppard days, it was a blessing because we had two great, I mean, truly great electronics guys out with us. The first was Steve Cater. You know, I mean, he was so instrumental in getting Rick Allen back on his feet and getting that drum kit built. I mean, he invented the shark pedal for all intents and purposes. But he was always doing all kinds of great stuff with guitar amps, all kinds of stuff out there. I mean, we were doing circuit level stuff out there. And then he passed away on the first tour, and Wally came in to replace him, and Wally was just sensational as well. So I was very fortunate to have those guys at my disposal, and I learned so much from those guys. Good grief.
Wally has a legacy of Wally boxes. His ISO transformers live on, still in inventory.
Heck yeah, they do. Yeah, they do. All right, guys, I'm going to pull the ripcord here. I got to get to editing anyway, so please enjoy this. Thanks for coming by. Oh, I have one. If you didn't read it in the email, this is a programming note. Just my schedule is dictating it. I'm going to have to move the lab to every other week now. Okay, so we're going to go the first and the third week of every month. I think it kind of works out that way, first and third week. Okay, so please be aware, I will not be back in next week. But we will be in the following week. So it's going to have to go to every other week now because I got some other duties from Avid that have crept up on me here. So keep that in mind. Be sure and read those emails. There's good information in the emails, certainly about things like that. And on that note, I will see you guys later.